So what if you don't have an SLR and you still want to create similar effects and techniques? With this picture here that I found on the internet, which you are allowed to use even in your own artwork because it's NASA and thus a government tax funded organization, you can just go to the site, find the image. This one's pretty big, and you can either save this image to your desktop, or you can also copy the image by right-clicking on this image here, copying it, and if you open up Photoshop and you create a new file, I like to use shortcuts, Command N, but you can also click here. It will try to pick the size of the actual image that's in the clipboard. That's the thing I copied. That's called the clipboard. And then I will paste it into this blank thing that has the correct dimensions. So I'm going to hit create, remembering the pixels that you would need eventually. In my case, I'm going to leave the 10,000 pixels, even though that's way too big, because I'm trying to paste that image that I have right now, and it'll be easier to change the image size later. However, I do want to make sure that this is RGB and I have a white background. I'm going to hit create, and I will paste. Again, shortcut is Command V, and you will see that here under paste, Command V. There we go. And then because it is pretty big, I'm going to go to image size. And for our case, I'm going to get you familiar with this number, 1920 by 1080, which is HD. We'll cover that later on when we do motion, animation, and videos. But right now, it's also just a good size for what I need. And I'm not going to print this, so 72 dots per inch is fine because it's not for printing, so it's really just for the screen resolution, which my screen is about this size. That makes the file a lot more manageable. You can zoom out, or I can double click on the hand and that will make it fit perfectly. So how do we make this look like it's actually motion blurred, like it's moving through this landscape? Right now it looks very static. So to make it move, some people think, well, you could just do motion blur. But let me show you what happens. I'm going to just do a quick selection. I'm not even going to do a great job, but you'll see the main issue when I do a motion blur with just the existing setting. Here is under filter blur, motion blur, and if I just do that on this selection, you can see it kind of does that. Even if I lower the resolution, it looks like more it's like it's shaking rather than moving through the landscape. If you remember from the photographs we took, when a picture is blurred, it still has a kind of leading line, and then the blur goes behind, especially if you used a flash or a way to light the actual focus point. So how do we do that, create that motion? So we can't do it this way, because again, not only will it blur this way, but it also might blur into the landscape. So first thing we want to do is do a better selection, and you can use the tools you learned already, lasso tool, or some of these quick selection tools, or other tools that you learned in the first assignment. But I'm also going to experiment here with the select subject. It's a little built AI in Photoshop that lets it figure out what the subject is. And let's see if it does a good job. Pretty good job. It knew that this is the subject matter that I want. However, it thought that maybe some of these elements do not belong to the subject. So I'm going to shift, remember, adds, alt, subtracts, shift, or if you don't like shortcuts, you can use shift as the add, and alt, that's the button to subtract. But I like to use shortcuts. So I'm going to shift, and I'm going to add these parts. Alrighty. For the effect that I'm doing, I may not have to be quite perfect, but I'll do my best to get as close as possible. Alright, I definitely don't want, I want this, but I do not want it. For some reason I thought this was a subject matter, so I'm going to subtract out this land. Alrighty, so I'm going to shift this wheel and subtract out this land. And subtract out this land. Alrighty. Shift that, shift that, shift this whole wheel. And this little piece. And that little piece. Alright, that's pretty good. Oh, let's some gaps here. Let's grab those pieces. Alrighty, so let's assume that's pretty good for now. What I'm going to do first to create that motion blur but also have that leading edge of the object is I'm going to copy Command C this object, and on a new layer here, I'll try to bring that closer so you could see that. Oops. The new layer button here, I'm going to paste. Now, sometimes it pastes in place, but just to make sure, paste in place is right here. That means we'll put exactly where the other one is, where I cut it from or copied it from. So now this one here, the rover that is on its own layer, that one I'm going to go ahead and do the motion blur. Now you can see there it goes, depending how fast it's moving. Let's just try that for now. And what I'm going to do so that we can see the leading edge of the main object is I'm going to make this motion blur layer a little more transparent so we could see it. The other one. See, there's the other one. See, if I go 0% opacity, you could see the main one. But if I go a little higher here, higher. Now, once I do that, I'm going to grab my move tool, which is right here. Let's see, I put it here. This move tool. And I'm going to grab that blurred piece and I'm going to shift it to the side like that. Okay. So now, can you see how it looks like it's speeding in this direction? So that's how you could create a motion blur effect. Now I'm going to use the same image to create, if you ever lose your pieces like I just did now, there's two ways to get everything back. You can go to Workspace and reset Essentials, or you can look for the tool palette right here. But I'm just going to go ahead and reset Essentials. Got my tool panel back. And how do we create the effect of using a large aperture opening to create the atmosphere perspective? Now, if we've done, some of you may have done the atmosphere perspective assignment already. If you have not, you will get into more details of this later. But for now, just to give you a rough picture, I'm going to hide the blur and leave this here. And I should have saved that selection so I can do it again. But I guess it's not a big deal since I'm really just trying to blur the background as it goes here and it gets over there. It gets more blurry. And this focal plane will stay in focus. And I'll leave this stuff in the front also in focus, but you can use the same technique to blur it if you want and to create that atmospheric perspective or that focus blur that you see out of focus in a large aperture photograph. So again, I'll just do very quickly. I'm going to go to this layer, the layer that has the landscape, and I'm going to grab just the background because I don't want to blur the thing. And if I do get into the rover and blur the rover by accident, what I can also do is I could copy it and put it on its own layer so it does not get blurred. But right now you can see I grabbed the background. Now you don't want to just blur here, and the blur that I would use is Gaussian blur. You don't want to just do that like this because then you'll see you have a very sharp line between focus and blur. So undo that. What you want to do is under the modify feather, you want to feather the area so that the blur happens gradually over the selection. Now I am used to doing it the old way, so I do it this way under select, modify feather selection. And this is how many pixels it will gradually blur. And remember, this picture is about 1920 by 1080, so 1000 pixels across. So this area is probably about 200 pixels. So I would type in 200 and say OK. And now when I blur, using my Gaussian blur, you can see that it happens gradually. Now you can see how when I did feather it, it did incorporate the rover into the piece. So I would have to go to my lasso tool and deselect that area. And now the feather should still be on there. I could do that, and you could see that the blur is more gradual. Okay. And creates more of that atmosphere perspective thing. And you can see it did get into the rover a little bit. So if I was to do this again, I would select the rover and put it on its own layer, so that although I guess with this effect, it gets to hide those mistakes, and then it looks pretty good. Okay. Now I did say that I do the feathering the old way. How would you do it the new way? Another way that, again, you may have reviewed, let me redo. I can do Shift Command Z also. Is here, there's the select and mask button. So instead of doing it my way, you go here and select and mask. And you can see here, it's showing you the selection. And look at this edge here as I increase the feather. See how it's getting softer? See, sharp edge, softer. And it means that whatever effect I do on this will be that gradual. And so I say OK. And you'll be like, oh, nothing happened. Well, again, a feathering doesn't do anything to the image. It just tells the selection that whatever effect you do to it, to do it gradually. In my case, I was doing blurring. But let's say you want to do something like hue and saturation. And I want to saturate that. You could see saturation happens strongly in the main area and then gradually goes to the regular saturation versus a sharp thing because of the feather. So again, that selected mask, you may not see anything happen because it's really just affecting the selection.